Hi, welcome. Today we'll be covering an aspect of asset management planning, which involves how do we name our utilities assets. My name is Nick Willis. I'm with the Environmental Finance Center at Wichita State University. So when we look at naming our assets, one of the key ideas is to keep in mind that your asset management plan and the name of the assets will be interfaced with all the time in the future. So we want to ensure that we make the names useful for our assets. So there's some tests that you can have for your naming conventions that you're thinking about. One of those would be if your utility were to hire a new person into your utility staff, can the recent hire identify the type of asset that is involved with the asset name? So would the utility, the recent hire of your utility be able to understand this is a pipe, this is a pump, this is a storage tank, for example? Another test would be, could that recent hire who has gained some familiarity with your systems roughly locate where that asset is in either the distribution system or the collection system? Now, for assets that are part of a pumping system or treatment facility, could the recent hire also know approximately where the asset is in a treatment system or pumping building? So in a treatment facility, it might indicate by the type of treatment in it. So a high service pump is obviously towards the end of a water treatment facility. A sludge pump is going to be in a certain place in an activated sludge wastewater treatment facility. So by the type of the asset within the utility, will the name help identify the type of the asset and therefore where it is in the treatment system or pumping building? Another test could be, if you were to hire a consultant in your utility, consultants will often want to have your utility asset IDs, at least for those that they're going to be working nearby or designing around. Could that consultant likewise identify the asset type by the name? Could they also locate that asset quickly? And then would they be able to tell specific asset information if it were contained in the name? So for example, some utility naming schemes will indicate the type of pump you have. So is it submersible? Is it vertical turbine, for example? Oftentimes pipe may have diameter within the pipe name. And you can also see some naming schemes that would also include the pipe material within it. So think about, from an outsider with just a little bit of familiarity to your system, is your naming convention, is your naming of your utility assets useful to them for the work that they will be doing? We also want to look at, well, what exactly is useful, what is perhaps not useful. So example number one here, 138 LK-15J. I don't know what kind of information is conveyed in this. It could absolutely be assigned to an asset in your utility, but coming into your utility, if I were to come into your utility, I would be really stretched to understand what that asset is, what role it plays in your utility. However, given a little bit of time to become familiar with your naming conventions, I could probably get somewhere with an asset naming style such as this. WW is probably wastewater. If you have multiple utilities under your control. PMP likely is going to be pump. ST1, I'm assuming, might be something like a pump station number one. You'll often see, some sort of serial numbering towards the end of a utility naming convention, such as 002. More likely than not, this means it is the second pump, either in this pump station or it's the second generation of pump that has been in that position. So that tells me quite a bit of information about what this is and where it is. Likewise, moving out to the water distribution system, HY is more likely than not a fire hydrant. You will often see some sort of locational device, such as 200 POPL. 200 likely is signifying the block, and then POPL is something like Poplar Street. Number 509 is more likely than not just the hydrant inventory number within your utility system. So that hydrant number 509 would link back to this hydrant at this location, and you would have records that you could pull up from it based on that. Similarly, still out in the distribution system, VLVG is likely a gate valve within the water distribution system. Similar to the hydrant naming scheme here, we have a likely address, 15,800 Redbud. And then 1509, similar to the hydrant, is likely just the valve identification number. That doesn't tell you a whole lot more information, but if you were to look it up, would be useful for gathering more information. Finally, looking at a water production facility, likely CHLR is likely a chlorinator. WLL4, more likely than not, would indicate well number 4. And then 008 may be a serial number, meaning it's the 8th chlorinator at well number 4, or perhaps it's the 8th chlorinator that your utility has had over time. Each utility will end up with naming schemes that are unique to their particular situation, and we'll talk about that more coming up. More tests of usefulness. Is it searchable? So you may have a name naming scheme, and you may be asked sometime, well, how many hydrants do we have in our total utility inventory? If you have a naming scheme that is readily searchable and in a software or database that is readily searchable, your names can really go a long ways towards answering questions such as that, like how many do we have? Also important, perhaps, is it sortable within a spreadsheet? So can you pull out all of the information from wherever it's being stored with your asset names and then sort it? So for example, we had an example that started with WW. More likely than not, the naming convention would have all wastewater assets would have WW in the beginning of their names. This can really be helpful when it's like, how many wastewater assets do we have under our control? So having the ability to sort within a spreadsheet may be useful. Typically in that case, you're going to have alphabetic sorting. So you may not want to have your names begin with a number. Though you could have a naming scheme where that could work, but more likely than not, it's going to be something like WW for wastewater, PW for potable water, etc. What can be contained within the ID name itself? So each asset has, many, if not dozens, of attributes associated with it. And sometimes it may be wise to include some of those attributes within that name ID. So here we have WA, likely is signifying it's part of water. 8IN is likely an 8-inch distribution main. CI likely is an indicator that it is cast iron. This can be super useful in that you know this is an 8-inch pipe, so you know the size, you can gauge some of the risk of an 8-inch pipe. Cast iron, that gives you a relatively reasonable time frame on how old this pipe could be. And also just based on town growth, where in town it might be. And then you see, 300 Westport Street most likely is the end of it. So when you're assigning names, figure out if it's valuable to put that information in the name or if it's going to be further down. So you can absolutely have names that don't contain material of the pipe in the idea. And you want to think through this because as I mentioned, some of these assets may have dozens of different attributes. You don't want a naming convention that gets to all of those attributes, because you want names that aren't super long, and that are easier to keep track of, to write down, to attach work orders to. So a little bit of a balancing act when we're looking at the usefulness of naming there. We also want to have a naming convention that keeps in mind that assets are going to be replaced and also updated over time. So some assets, just kind of by asset type, are going to benefit from a series naming convention. This is going to largely be those assets such as pumps, chlorinators, motors, that have relatively limited life expectancies. So this is something you're going to perhaps have a sewer lift station that may be in the ground for 50 years, but your pumps are going to be replaced multiple times over them. This is a situation where having the series naming convention at the end might be really useful. So you would know that this is pump 002 at the pump station. And just at a very high level, if you have a pump station where you're on series 3, 4, and 5, and there's still a pump on series 1, that should lead you to begin to ask questions about what's going on. Is that first pump ever even running? Are these other pumps installed differently? Are they facing a difference in flows? Are they being operated differently? Why are they having such short lives compared to the one with the longer life? So there is definite value in the series naming convention. There are some types of assets where it's probably not useful to have. So going back to the water distribution pipe, so the 8-inch cast iron main, water lines often are in the ground 50, 100, even greater than a century in time. So having a series naming and numbering convention is probably not going to give you a lot of value because pipe is so long lived. However, as we have discussed, both the size and the material can be useful. So what do you want to relay in that naming convention? So utilities are often not a standalone. They're in some other organizational structure. So many smaller utilities are going to have some sort of a public work type of situation as demonstrated here. So the public works department at a municipality may run streets, sewer, and water. There may be other things they are responsible for, but the general idea is that the asset ID naming convention should work for the other assets within your larger organization. So in this case, when the water and sewer departments of public works are figuring out their names, they should keep in mind, would this naming convention work for the streets department? So for the pavement, for the curb and gutter, for perhaps storm sewer catch basins, for the street sign inventory. Will this naming convention work beyond your single water utility or sewer utility? So understanding how your town or utility is broken down by department is valuable when you're setting up how we name IDs within the community or broader utility situation. So again, keeping in mind, should your IDs reflect this reality? And the answer is probably yes for most situations, unless if perhaps streets already has a completely different naming structure that doesn't make any sense for water or sewer. So sometimes it may be valuable to go your own way. You also keep in mind that there's a lot of different utility hierarchies. Many municipalities would have something like this, where there's a utilities department and then the various utilities within your community break down. As you get larger, you'll probably have more complex naming structures, and that's appropriate because you'll have more employees, you'll have more facilities, you'll have more assets. So having a naming structure that reflects the complexity of your own organization is important. So I hope has been helpful to you. I do want to highlight that as part of the Environmental Finance Center network, there is technical assistance. So it could be on naming your utility assets, but it could also be on anything here listed on this slide. So perhaps you're beginning creating an asset management plan. Perhaps there's budgeting help that's needed, or financial planning, utility rate setting, looking at revenues and expenses. Perhaps you're looking at turnover in your utility, and you have to think about succession planning, job descriptions, and salaries. For any of these, if you're a water utility serving under 10,000 people, or a wastewater with average flow rates of under 1 million gallons per day, there is free, no cost technical assistance. Just go to efcnetwork.org and click on Get Help icon to request assistance. With that, I wish you luck as you name your utility assets, and best wishes.